Good afternoon or morning, everyone. We'll get started here shortly. I'm just going to give some folks more time to join in if they'd like to. All right. I think we'll probably go ahead and kick this off. Just make sure I am set up on my end. Cool. So, first in our webinar series today, Hal is planning to bring a series of webinars for free to folks to share some of our knowledge and give back to the community a bit during these challenging times. I do hope that everyone in attendance is staying safe and is healthy. But that's really the last I want to talk about the coronavirus today, because I'm sure all of us are exhausted of discussing that topic. So we can get on to more fun things such as extraction safety. So who am I? My name's Xavier. I am the outside sales manager here at Hal Extraction. And I've actually been in the cannabis industry since 2013 in Colorado. I started off on the retail side of things before moving more into the manufacturing business back in the early days, right at the beginning of the adult use boom in 2014, 2016. And I saw a lot of interesting things during that time. This was pre-regulation, kind of, let's say, pre-outside insight into safety and best practices in the extraction industry. And as you can imagine, there were some fairly questionable practices at the time. So I'd like to really share what I learned throughout the years, both hands-on in an operational capacity, but then of course, what I've learned through working with folks in my role here at Hal, and over the last few years outside of the cannabis industry, working with some high-risk oil and gas, construction, that kind of thing, and helping them manage hazardous material safety procedures. Looks like most of us in the presentation here are actually a number of my coworkers. You guys probably know me fairly well, and the company fairly well. But for those of you that don't know Hal and who we are a group of cannabis industry professionals really dedicated to improving extraction safety and making safe operating environments more readily accessible to the industry. We were established in 2016. And all of our products are designed in-house with industrial hygienists, mechanical, electrical, and manufacturing engineers to really offer the safest, but also the most cost-effective solutions when it comes to Class 1, Division 1, and Class 1, Division 2 environments for the cannabis industry. Now, these are all designed with the strictest of regulations in mind. And so we are very successful at getting environments approved by local regulators and jurisdictions to ensure that license holders in the industry are able to get their operations up off the ground. And so what are we going to talk about today? Well, as you can imagine, Extraction Safety 101 will be a fairly basic topic. We thought that it'd be good to start with Extraction Safety 101 and then move into more detailed and, let's say, enlightening webinars down the road as we bring in some of our partners and other folks in the industry to share their knowledge and increase the series and the education that we're giving to folks from here. And so this is really designed to be introductory, some basic concepts in here. I do want to mention 2 quick disclaimers. This is not designed to be targeting a specific manufacturing process, of course, more of a general course. It also is not designed to specifically target hemp versus THC extractions or a specific jurisdiction. If there are any licensed producers here in the audience today, I cannot stress enough that your local regulatory body is going to be the end all when it comes to how to properly conduct your operations in your facility and how to set up a safe operating environment for your employees. That being said, there are some general themes that we can see in all these jurisdictions and operations, and so I really wanted to touch upon that today. So we're going to start with employee safety. For me, this is really the main focus of any safety program. Facility safety and equipment safety are more operational and cost-saving areas, whereas employee safety is specifically meant to keep your employees safe and out of harm's way, which should be the main goal of any safety procedures you have in place. Employees are also interesting to me because they are the highest variable in your operation. Your equipment and your facility are designed to run in a specific way, whereas your employees can experience lapses in judgment, in focus, in forgetfulness, let's say, and can potentially fall out of standard operating procedures, which can lead to incidents, accidents, and the worst of cases, bodily harm. And then finally here at the end, what I will do is open up to some questions. So if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat feature on the webinar solution here, and I will do my best to get to those once we get through the slides I have put in place. All right, so some real information. As I mentioned before, employees really are the most important piece of your safety program. So as such, it is incredibly important that you have standard operating procedures and programs in place to ensure consistent behavior and practices for each and every employee. The nice thing about standard operating procedures and consistent practices is that if all your employees are trained the same way and on the same page, ultimately they will act to regulate each other. So you might have 2 employees that are operating your equipment. One employee can see the other one doing something they shouldn't be doing, can help them to readjust that behavior and then prevent any incidents from happening. We'll talk more about documentation in a sec, but let's start with the bodily protection for specific employees. So bodily protection, PPE, personal protective equipment, serves to keep your employees out of harm's way and to protect your product from outside contaminants. Enforcing PPE rules is going to be a big piece in keeping your employees out of harm's way. I like to think that there's really 3 main areas when it comes to personal protection equipment, those being eye protection, respiratory protection, and skin protection. I strongly advise, and I think it's nice to see that a lot of operators in the industry are taking the approach of, let's say, a no-frills approach to PPE. Make it mandatory as a company. Do your best to provide the equipment to your employees and reward employee behavior that do end up following the regulations and procedures you have in place for PPE. There should be no excuse from the employee side to not protect themselves and keep them safe, but then also, of course, reduce the risk of outside contaminants being introduced into your extraction processes. So eye protection, all of these are fairly self-explanatory, but again, as an introductory webinar, I want to make sure all bases are covered. So as most of us know, when you are in an active extraction operation, there are pressurized vessels, irritating chemicals, and particulate matter to contend with. And so if there were to be a failure to occur, all of these different things do have the potential to be traveling at high speeds towards your eyes. For example, you can have feed that's packed into columns. Typically, this is ground into fine, small particles. It can cause significant irritation to your eyes and can even do things like cause allergic reactions. And so the last thing you really want is to have an employee that's struggling to see to actually be operating some dangerous equipment and potentially slip up and cause an incident to occur. So one policy that I have typically had in place in the past, and I think most operations should have, is that eye protection is always used inside your control areas, anywhere inside the facility. I've actually splashed ethanol into my own eyes while cleaning equipment, and I can tell you that is not a fun experience. And so having eye protection in place at all times in your facility, I think, is paramount to protecting your employees' eyes and vision in the future. So anything like conventional glasses, goggles, any sort of eye protection that you can think of to basically stop foreign matter from reaching the sensitive areas in and around your eyes. This also has a twofold effect of preventing employees from actually rubbing their eyes with their gloves, which of course can introduce contaminants to their eyes, but then of course can actually introduce contaminants from their eyes into the gloves and then into your product. So we want to prevent employee injury, but then also maintain the integrity and quality of the products that you're producing. The next area of PPE is skin protection. Skin protection can be something as simple as maintaining, a gloves, long sleeves, jeans, and work boots policy, or it could be as complex as providing lab coats, hair nets, and shoe slippers, similar to this image that we see here, to your staff. Gloves, I think, are the one area that really are non-negotiable. They should always be used during the extraction process. Similar to eye protection, finely ground feed can irritate your skin and cause allergic reactions. Solvents that we use in extraction processes and cleaning can irritate the skin, cause chemical burns. And you really don't want your employees to be handling your product directly with their hands. And I think this is something we can all appreciate in this time with the virus going around, that we want to reduce the amount of times that we're touching things directly with our skin. Now, I think the best thing to do is take the most active approach possible. So similar to what I said earlier, you really don't want to give employees the ability to negotiate around actually wearing skin protection. I see a lot of facilities now have prep rooms, company provided gloves, lab coats, hair nets, shoe slippers, and all these things ensure that everyone's fully protected and can minimize, again, the outside contaminants introduced to your processes. Beard nets are another thing that I haven't really mentioned. I think these are important. A lot of extractors have nice full beards, and you don't want to have hair introduced into your product, and you do not want your beard to be catching fire. All right, and so the final PPE area, respiratory protection. So just like Walter White here, there's dangerous fumes and airborne particulates inside the operation. Last thing you want to do is inhale a bunch of keef, dust, particulate, any fumes from the chemicals. And so adequate respiratory protection means that your employees are safe from these things entering their airways. And then, of course, just like the rest of the PPE, serve a double purpose of reducing the potential for employees to be coughing, sneezing, or introducing any sort of outside contaminants to your products. So again, all fairly basic. Those are the three main areas of PPE I think that are important to focus on when it comes to extraction processes. But I think the most important thing for employees beyond the PPE they wear is really the training and the documentation you have in place to ensure that your operations are consistent. And so safety training should really be focused on the following areas, I think, when it comes to extraction at least. Equipment operation, hazardous material handling, and of course, emergency situations. So training when it comes to equipment operation will ensure that all your employees use your extraction equipment the same way and can monitor each other and again, police each other for any lapses in focus or judgment. A good example of this would be ensuring that there is a minimum of 2 people checking equipment every time it's turned on or in between, let's say, processing runs to reduce danger to themselves, but then also to future employees that turn on that equipment. Equipment, of course, is expensive, and so improper use can lead to damage. Damaged equipment, of course, can't be used. Production halts. You can't meet customer demands. And so there's kind of a chain effect of negative things that happen when employees are not properly trained on the equipment and how to use it. Now, hazardous material training, make sure that each employee understands the risks associated with working with hazardous chemicals and being in a hazardous chemical environment. And so things like properly transfilling gas vessels, properly connecting transfer lines, proper storage practices when operations are winding down for the day. All these areas are very important to focus training on and ensure again that there is a consistent level of training for all your employees and so that everyone is doing everything the same way. I do think that new employees should go through official trainings either with management on your staff or through an accredited third party. And ideally we'll have a shadow period to monitor and shadow a veteran member of your team and learn from them exactly hands-on how to go through these processes and correct procedures. And finally, emergency situation training will really ensure that employees are all acting the same way in the case of an accident or failure. So typically, you want to ensure that employees are able to quickly vacate any hazardous areas. They are proficient in using things like chemical showers, eye washes, and if you do happen to have a manually operated facility or equipment, are able to quickly shut down those operations and turn off those equipments in the case of an accident. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this video, but if you need any further convincing on emergency situation training, just go onto YouTube after this webinar, search New Mexico hash lab explosion, watch the first video that pops up, and you'll see exactly what I mean by making sure that employees are well trained on how to properly vacate an area. It is a little bit of a graphic video, so I will warn you about that, but it does serve as a good reminder as to why employees need to be well trained on how to properly vacate a specific area. And so the final piece of employee safety that I want to focus on is documentation. So again, I'm kind of beating a dead horse when it comes to the standardization of training, but documentation really does ensure that employees are all trained the same way. I can reference back to the same materials so that operations do proceed in the same way for each employee. It is also very important to have documentation in place in the case of, let's say, a regulatory inspection from either a local cannabis body, OSHA, or really any regulatory body. You want to show that you are doing the most possible to train and enforce training with your employees by having documentation on site. Beyond just standard operating procedures, I think it's also important to include documentation like maintenance schedules, let's say chemical levels inside storage facilities, and cleaning schedules to really ensure there's never a lapse in your equipment integrity, your chemical storage processes, or the contamination of your product through, let's say, degrading equipment. And the last piece of documentation that's going to be key to a successful operation is going to be incident investigation. And so if there were to be an incident that took place in your facility, you want to document the cause and outcome of that incident and ensure that you and your employees can learn from that incident and then can mitigate any similar incidents from happening in the future. All right, so let's get into equipment safety. So I thought equipment safety made sense to follow employee safety because really equipment is going to be an extension of your employees. They are directly interfacing with your equipment, but there's also critical points in your operation where you're going to want to introduce trained professionals to the mix and make sure that everything is verified and properly inspected by a third party. I'm going to say it now and I will say it again later, maybe multiple times. I really cannot stress enough that you should not be performing repairs or structural maintenance on your equipment. If there is any damage visible to, let's say, a pressure vessel or a piece of your equipment that is responsible for carrying volatile chemicals, you should stop using that equipment immediately and should refer back to the manufacturer on how to best proceed. A lot of manufacturers will just replace that piece for you, or you can send that equipment back to them and they will perform the repair. So the first step in equipment safety is going to be selecting the right equipment for your operation. So typically the equipment that you're selecting is going to be dictated by the type of solvent you want to use, your desired throughput, your desired final products. Room size and ventilation, however, will be a factor into what sort of equipment you're able to use. So this is something that you want to do early on in your facility design process. You want to know what kind of equipment you're using and ensure that your facility is being designed and built to accommodate that equipment. I think there are, a number of consultants out there now that can take into consideration things like your desired product, throughput capacity, facility plans, and local regulations, and can offer up models of equipment that will really fit your needs. So I think it's a good time to introduce a third-party consultant to the process and ensure that you are selecting the right equipment. I think it's also goes without saying that using U.S.-based manufacturers and specifically, equipment that's designed for cannabis extractions is the way to go. It's pretty easy to source general lab equipment online, but a lot of it's not going to be quite as safe as stuff that's specifically designed for cannabis extractions. And of course, if there were to be any issues with your equipment, I think online retailers can be notoriously difficult to engage, and they, I think, are the mark in the industry of what I mean by manufacturer responsiveness and making sure that we are indeed, or you are indeed taken care of the way you need to if there are any issues with your equipment. Generally, it's important to know, I think, that active recovery units have more points of failure and inherently are more susceptible to safety issues. That's not to say that they're less safe to operate. I just think that folks need to be trained better on how to operate them and do understand the inherent risks of using an active recovery system, whereas a passive recovery unit is going to be a little bit safer to operate, but of course has less throughput capacity. And so just some things to consider. And so once you have selected your proper unit, you're going to want to move into the install phase. The install phase is, I think, the most critical point when it comes to equipment safety. And so a lot of manufacturers will actually offer up installation courses. So you can have a member of your team visit the manufacturer, become accredited and actually installing their units and can do so at your facility. I think a lot of manufacturers will also offer sending a technician to your facility to install the equipment for you. Another good option, of course, anytime a professional is involved, the outcome on the safety side of things down the road is going to be a net positive. And the more complex the equipment, the more complex the install. And so really, I can't stress enough that having trained consultants do this for you will save you time, headaches, and increase the safety of your operations down the road. And the final piece of the install is going to be field verification. So to ensure that it is safely installed, you want to have someone from a third-party service come out and actually perform field verification of your equipment. And so we actually partner pretty closely with the folks at UL and PSI. I think PSI are well renowned to be some of the leaders when it comes to third-party verification inspections of equipment once it's been installed. Most jurisdictions do actually require this as part of the licensing process. I do think it's important that even if your local jurisdiction does not require it, you do it anyways. There are things that you might not know about when it comes to the integrity of the equipment that a third-party inspection can bring to light. Typically, the inspections will focus on the integrity of pressure vessels, inspection of lines and various breakpoints, kind of weak points in your equipment, and just verify in general that the install was done correctly. The inspector is also going to verify the environment around the equipment is properly ventilated and has the necessary components in place for safe operating of the equipment. And I think, going back to PSI, they specifically have been doing this for the cannabis industry for a while now. So I think they're always a good source when it comes to third-party verifications. But again, once the equipment's been installed, and typically prior to really getting into heavy operational use, you're going to want to have someone come out and just make sure that everything is put together correctly. Now, I did mention maintenance being important, and that it's important to source maintenance back to the manufacturer. That being said, a lot of extraction equipment is designed to be used with components that will degrade over time. So things like clamps, bolts, nuts, gaskets, filters, images I have here on the screen, even let's say solvent transfer lines. A lot of these things will degrade and show signs of wear and tear after repeated use. So I think another important piece of equipment safety is to perform regular inspections of these components and make sure that they are maintaining their integrity. But then also have a strict maintenance schedule in place to ensure that these components are being replaced regularly, regardless of how they appear. I think humans have a great knack of missing things that are important. And so just by having a regular schedule in place, you can ensure these components maintain their integrity and stay in a safe state. I said I was going to mention it again, and here I am. So, finally, if any of these pressure containing vessels, any kind of structural components in your equipment show any sort of damage, you absolutely should stop operations and get that equipment repaired. These vessels are pressure rated because they're designed, and a dent or a crack or something like that will obviously reduce the amount of pressure that vessel can hold, which of course can turn it into a dangerous situation for your employees. All right. And facility safety. So employees and equipment all go inside your facility. So I thought that'd be a nice way to kind of wrap up our little safety presentation here. So because a lot of the time extraction operations are dealing with pressurized and combustible solvents during these processes, it is paramount that you have things like proper ventilation and fire suppression in place in your facility. There are also considerations to make when it comes to signage that you place in your facility. There's a lot of studies that show that even just a daily reminder of training of a hazardous environment, of trying to reduce ignition sources, things like that, just that daily reminder can go a long way in improving safety and practices for your employees. And as we've all experienced, if you're in a stressful situation, it can sometimes be difficult to recall exactly how to conduct yourself. And so having signs around can quickly help employees recenter themselves and act properly in the case of an incident. Um, Exits are very important as well. Going back to that video I mentioned earlier, you really should have accessible exits for your employees to quickly and efficiently vacate and escape from dangerous situations. This means having doors that open outwards and have panic bars on them, and just in general allow employees to quickly escape a dangerous situation. And then finally, an ideal lab setup, and this is not something that I see too often, but I'm starting to see more and more. Will have a number of automatic processes included in the facility. So you want to make sure that processes like ventilation, fire suppression, um, these things can be taken out of the hands of your employees and automated through controls and sensors, so that the actual facility is designed to respond in kind if there were to be failure or some sort of dangerous environment inside the lab. So that way the employees, of course, can focus again on vacating the area and their personal safety and not necessarily on shutting down the equipment. Because extraction operations typically involve using combustible or flammable solvents like hydrocarbons or ethanol, you want to have fire suppression in place that can adequately put a fire out if there were to be some sort of failure like that. Initial explosions and ignitions can, of course, be dangerous in their own rights, but because there's largely spent feed inside an operation room or even things like employee clothes, there is fuel readily available inside that environment for that initial combustion or explosion to ignite and cause a sustaining fire. So, fire suppression is extremely important in taking that fire out of the picture and can be automatically triggered when a certain level of heat is detected. So you want to have all this be automated, just similar to a conventional fire suppression system. Again, this is nothing too revolutionary here, but if a certain level of heat were to be detected inside the environment, the fire suppression would kick into place, and the fire suppressant would be released and ideally put out that fire before causing too much damage. I think it's also important to have a handheld local fire extinguisher readily accessible for employees. This allows them to manage smaller fires. So if an employee were to identify that a small fire was starting, and it hadn't gone to the point where it's dangerous enough for that employee to have to vacate the premise, they could, of course, put out the fire right then and there and prevent further damage from happening or, a greater incident from escalating. And ideally, the fire suppression system will also be tied to an alarm system. So if there were to be an incident where the fire suppression system were activated, alarms would be sounded, and folks that weren't in the direct vicinity would be well aware that there was a fire occurring inside the control zone. Another important piece of facility safety is going to be having adequate ventilation. So international regulations dictate that control areas that contain hazardous chemicals must be properly ventilated. The amount of required airflow, of course, is going to vary based on the hazardous chemicals being stored or used in that environment. But the idea here is really that the ventilation prevents these chemicals from pooling and amassing to the point where they become a combustible source and a safety issue, both for ultimately explosion reasons, but then also respiratory reasons. So you don't want your butane to pool to the point where it actually does hit those lower explosive limits and becomes a fuel source. And so you want to have fans in place, similar to let's say like a paint booth or an extraction booth that we manufacture, to ensure that proper ventilation is always in place and that the air inside the booth or inside your lab is indeed being vacated from that space quickly and adequately in times of need. Now, the next slide provides a little bit more detail, but I do want to circle back to the automation piece I mentioned. I think it is very important that the ventilation system have an automation component. So you can have a regular operating airflow, and then let's say a certain condition is met, such as lower explosion limit, activating your sensors. The environment can then ramp up airflow and vacate that air more efficiently, and then can ramp back down once a safe environment condition has been re-achieved. So this all ties together with the controls and automation. So by having an active system in place, we can really monitor the environment inside of your lab. I think this is extremely important because humans in general are ill-equipped to detect dangerous environments through our senses, smell, sight, and touch. It's hard to identify, especially with a lot of the medical grade solvents used in extraction processes, if there were to be a dangerous amount of butane in the air, for example. And so making sure that you have proper sensors and controls in place to detect these dangerous environments will prevent a lot of bodily harm and injury to your employees. And so at a minimum, you really want the LEL sensor, like I have here on the screen, that's calibrated specifically to the solvent that you're using in your extraction processes. What this does is it will detect when a certain concentration of that solvent has a mass in the air. That concentration is going to be the amount that is needed if the ignition source is introduced to actually cause an explosion. And so, of course, we want to avoid that amount from ever being created. And so the LEL sensor will identify if that does happen. And going back to the automation piece, if you do have the right controls in place, can kick your machinery or your ventilation at least into higher gear and vacate the air in your booth to ensure that a safe operating environment is achieved as quickly as possible. The other thing when it comes to automation that's important to mention is interlocking equipment. So it is a good idea if you are running an active system, if you have coolers or heaters as part of your extraction process, to have everything interlocked to your sensors, so that if a dangerous environment is detected in your facility, those machines will automatically shut off. That can go a long way in reducing the amount of ignition sources present in the room, which of course is important in reducing any potential for explosions or fires happening in that environment. So by automatically interlocking all this equipment, we can just make sure that, again, the humans don't necessarily have to interact with the equipment to shut it off. The humans can focus on vacating the premise, and the equipment will automatically shut down on its own. All right, and so the final slide I have here for, or not the second final slide actually, for facility safety is going to be ignition sources. One of the key pieces of any explosion-proof environment is going to be the elimination of potential ignition sources from the operating area. And so as we see on this, this fire triangle here, to create a fire or explosion, you need heat, fuel, and oxygen. And so, of course, oxygen is readily available in any environment. We need that to breathe, but fuel is also readily available because that is typically the solvent being used in your extraction process. And so the one area that we can really control and try to limit in these environments is going to be the heat or the ignition sources. So standard labs will be class 1, division 1, or class 1, division 2 rated. And the components within those environments will be also rated as such. And you want to make sure that any equipment that you're operating in that environment also meets that same rating. But it's also important to know that any outside equipment or even personal effects from employees introduced into that environment can also create ignition sources. So if you have tools that you're using for your equipment, you might want to make sure that those are spark proof. You don't want to use heat guns like I have up here on the screen, because that, of course, will ignite the solvents that you're using. And even things like static electricity can create enough of an ignition source to actually cause an explosion. I was actually managing a facility, and we had plastic trash bins with plastic trash bags inside of them. Of course, the interaction of pulling the plastic bag out of the plastic bin creates significant static electricity. And we did have an incident once where the spent feed inside of that bag did combust. Luckily, no one was injured, but it was a severe headache trying to clean up all the spent feed and having to shut down operations to clean the lab up from that small incident. And so you really want to make sure that your employees are well aware of the risks of bringing in outside equipment into the facility. And you can do that through signage. And so I think signage is really self-explanatory in that it reminds employees on a daily basis that they're working in hazardous areas. So you want to introduce things like hazardous material diamonds, reminders not to smoke in the facility, even little things like putting your cell phones away, or focusing on the task at hand. Reminders like that can really go a long way in improving employee safety. And then touching again upon the exits in your facility. In the case of an emergency, most employees should be focused on removing themselves from the environment. And so having exits that are properly marked with exit signs, having doors with panic bars on them that do open outwards, so an employee can just run into the door and get out of a dangerous environment, are all going to be key to allowing that employee to remove themselves from that environment and reduce the potential for that person to be injured in the case of an incident. So, final tips, just to kind of wrap this all up. I mentioned over and over training employees. I still think that these are the key areas you want to focus on increasing safety in your operations. So making sure that employees are all trained the same way. Everyone understands exactly how to operate equipment, how to protect themselves, and how to respond to dangerous situations are all going to go a long way in improving employee safety. Second, I think that listening to your employees is one of the most important things you can do if you are managing or own an extraction operation. They are on the front lines. They see the equipment daily. They are the ones actually conducting the operations. So they will be the ones that see first any potential points of failure or any, let's say, risky areas when it comes to your procedures that can cause them bodily harm in the future. Third, hire professionals to review, design, execute builds of your facility, to create your standard operating procedures, to create your safety practices, or at least review what you have in place. Go a long way. There's a lot of folks that have years and years of experience of managing operations, and they can take that operational experience and bring it to your facility and make sure that you are avoiding any mistakes that they may have made in the past. And then finally, it's going to be following codes and regulations. So, while this presentation really is designed to be an introductory approach to kind of standard safety concepts, let's say, in extraction labs, I think many jurisdictions have regulations and codes that are in place specifically to enforce a number of these concepts. So by following these codes and regulations, you're inherently going to be making your operations safer. And then failing to meet these regulations can lead to fines, can lead to temporary shutdowns, loss of license, but in the most severe cases, can lead to bodily harm or even death of employees. And so, because this is meant to be focused on safety, we really want to avoid any bodily harm or injury to employees. You can do that by following the codes and regulations that are put in place specifically to do so. And so that's what I had put together for today. Again, I know it was very basic and the first in our series of webinars, so there may have been some times where I was rambling on here, but our intent is to get these better and more refined as we go through the weeks here. And so what I plan on doing is starting to release more and more content, probably about one webinar a month, and ideally bring in some partners and some folks that have experience in specific areas of extraction to help provide better content to folks like yourselves. And so getting on to questions, I'm looking at the chat now, and I do see that we had a question about this being recorded. I didn't record it myself. I don't know if our technology will record this. I will look right after I get off the line here to see if we have a recorded version. What I can do, worst case, is certainly send over a PowerPoint, at least the deck that I presented today, send over the PowerPoint slides. I do think it's a good starting point for a lot of folks that do facility or kind of initial training. So we can absolutely send that information over. And then, of course, I'm always available for any further information. So if there are any questions or anything like that, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can visit our website, extractionbooth.com, or you can call our number, and we can get you the information that you guys need. All right, well, I think that's going to do it for today. I know, oh, okay. Perfect, thanks, Jared. So we'll just get a link from the webinar. And regardless, we'll make sure that everyone has access to that. I think one thing that we're working on is actually having these available on our website as well. So the idea is to build upon this base and again, have more detailed and specific webinars down the road. Appreciate that, Jared. Colin will definitely get you the PowerPoint. And then Pat, who's one of the members of HAL Extraction here, is asking about topics for the future. And I think one thing we'll do is maybe put a poll up on LinkedIn or on our website and get some good topics from the folks that do in the future. So with that being said, I think I'm gonna turn off the recording here, let you guys get on to your day. Hopefully, if you haven't had lunch yet, now's a good time. And if not, hope everyone stays safe. And we'll be seeing you here again within the next month or so. Thanks, guys.